So now we have arrived in Alexander's last war, the Mallian campaign. This is the 13th part of Alexander's Conquest series by Kings and Generals. Without any further ado, we ought to get into it.
Following the mutiny of Alexander's army at the Hephaestus sometime in the autumn of 326 BC, one would be forgiven for thinking that this marked the end of his campaign, that, as he had promised his men, he would begin the journey home. However, this was not the case. Instead, Alexander planned to campaign in the Indian subcontinent for almost a year longer, sailing down the Indus in pursuit of his long-held dream of reaching the ocean and fighting local tribes en route before making for Babylon. On the face of it, such tasks may have seemed straightforward, but this part of the campaign would prove to be one of the most grueling of Alexander's career, costing him the most losses for his army and nearly his own life. After the mutiny, Alexander marched his force back to the Hydaspes, rejoining Craterus, who had been left behind with a portion of the army to construct a fleet. In the few months that Alexander had been away, Craterus and his men had been remarkably productive, managing to construct 38 galleys, as well as hundreds of smaller vessels, numbering as many as 1,000 or 2,000 according to some ancient sources. At this same time, Alexander also received fresh men, likely from Greece, Babylon and Thrace, consisting of 30,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, along with 25,000 new suits of armor and medical supplies, all of which were badly needed. With his army refreshed and resupplied, Alexander began his voyage. Nearchus, his childhood friend, would command the armada, which would also carry Alexander, the Hypaspists, archers and companions. Craterus, meanwhile, was given command of part of the infantry and cavalry on the left bank, while Hephaestion commanded the rest of the force on the right bank. Both would march along the river in tandem with the fleet, acting as scouts and clearing any potential enemies. Alexander's division of his forces like this also served another purpose, however. Throughout his campaigns, court politics had become a bigger and bigger issue, with various generals beginning to feud with one another. Hephaestion and Craterus were two particularly noteworthy examples of this. Hephaestion enjoyed a particularly close relationship with Alexander, and as the campaign continued, he was entrusted with more and more responsibilities, consistently demonstrating himself to be a loyal and competent subordinate and a talented cavalry commander. Craterus was also greatly prized by Alexander, and throughout his campaign, Alexander regularly chose Craterus to be his primary defensive general, often entrusted with holding crucial strongpoints, such as the camp at the Hydaspes. The rivalry between Hephaestion and Craterus was well known, and at one point they had actually drawn swords against each other over a dispute regarding Alexander's Persianization, forcing Alexander to intervene personally. Alexander's division of his forces, while
Hephaestion had long been a supporter of Alexander's Persianization efforts, while Craterus opposed them. For a more detailed overview of Alexander's Persianization, check out our separate video on the topic.
while sailing the Hydaspes, was therefore not only a strategic decision, but also a shrewd move to separate the two feuding commanders. The army organized accordingly, Alexander set sail, making for the lands of the Oxydracians and Mallians, two people who had not yet paid tribute to him, and were rumored to be preparing for war. As the army moved down the Hydaspes and Acacenes rivers, they received the submission or surrender of a number of local tribes and cities, such as the Scythians, the majority not putting up a fight. When a tribe refused to submit, Alexander would disembark and gather his forces to storm their city. One such tribe was the Agalaceus, who put up fierce resistance, the resulting battle ending in the burning of their city, either accidentally or on Alexander's orders, before being conquered. There were other dangers besides these pockets of resistance. At the confluence of the Indus and the Acacenes, the fast-flowing rivers wreaked havoc amongst his fleet, some ships smashing together, and Alexander losing two of the larger ones. At one point, according to some sources, Alexander's own ship almost succumbed to the torrents, forcing him to strip off his armor and dive into the water in order to swim to safety. Despite these dangers, the majority of the fleet and the army successfully reached Mallian territory sometime in late 326 BC. The Mallians and Oxydracians were traditionally enemies, but upon hearing of Alexander's planned approach, they had formed an alliance in order to stop the invader. However, Alexander's rapid advance down the river meant that his enemies had not been able to properly combine their forces. As a result, Alexander decided on a blitzkrieg-esque strategy to quickly conquer the Mallians before the two forces could unite. To achieve this, he split his army into a number of parts. Alexander, with approximately 6,500 infantry, including the Hypaspists, archers and Agrianians, and 2,000 cavalry of companions and horse archers, was to attack from the north. Craterus would advance down the west bank of the river, while Hephaestion would march quickly down the east bank. Ptolemy was given another detachment and ordered to wait 3 days before advancing, while Nearchus would sail down the river to the borders of Mallian territory. With this strategy, Alexander planned to take the Mallians by surprise, attacking from multiple directions and forcing them to either retreat deeper into their territory, where they would be caught by Hephaestion's force or Nearchus's fleet, or forced to flee north, where Ptolemy would intercept them. It was an excellent example of how Alexander was not only a gifted tactician, but also a talented strategist. Nevertheless, his men were initially and understandably reluctant. Alexander had promised them that they would be returning home, but rather than halting his campaign, Alexander had simply diverted the campaign in a different direction. There was once again talk of mutiny, but Alexander was, on this occasion, able to quickly subdue the problem. He reassured the men that this campaign would be swift and straightforward, but still with the promise of plenty of glory and plunder, and that the ocean, the current aim of Alexander's ambition, was close. His men's grievances handled, the campaign began. It was a quick affair, Alexander marching 50 miles in just under 2 days and subduing all the Mallian towns west of the Hydraortes in just 7 days. However, it was also as ruthless as it was quick, Alexander's men killing any who resisted, including holy Brahmins. Perdiccas, with cavalry and light infantry, was dispatched from Alexander's force and sent to subdue other cities and chase down any fugitives to stop word of Alexander's advance spreading. The other portions of Alexander's army had been just as
Dang, he really blitzed them, man. I just love that he keeps having to win his soldiers over. 1 more month, guys, just 1 more month. He said that 10 years ago, Alexander. Just 1 more month. I don't know why. But yeah, I noticed Alexander's getting more brutal. Do you guys notice that? Like, I feel like complete sackings or destruction, like, Alexander didn't do it all the time earlier on, but I feel like now he's just going full on, like, you're with me or I kill you. Like, I don't know. I feel like he's getting more brutal as time went on, you know?
as ruthlessly efficient, forcing many Mallians to retreat to their capital. Leading expert on the history of ancient Macedonia, Albert Bosworth, described it as a conquest through terror, and although it is possible to explain Alexander's tactics as a grim necessity in order to end the campaign quickly and decisively, motivated by the men's recent talks of mutiny and the need to secure supply lines, it is also impossible to avoid the reality that the Mallian campaign was one of Alexander's most brutal. The strategy had nevertheless been successful in conquering much of the Mallian territory.
What follows comes largely from the narrative of Arrian, the most commonly accepted version of events. The other Alexander historians also recorded the event, occasionally giving different names and some minor differences, but they are broadly in agreement.
And Alexander now gathered his force to march on their capital. Initially, it seemed as if it would fall as quickly as many other places had to Alexander's army, his men quickly seizing the city. However, the attack stalled when the men tried to breach the citadel. To inspire his men to continue the attack and keep up the momentum, Alexander scaled a siege ladder himself, mounting the battlements. His men were invigorated by this display of bravery, the Hypaspists swarming the ladders behind him. However, under the weight of so many men, the ladders broke, leaving Alexander stranded on the battlements with only Leonatus, one of his 7 personal bodyguards, and Bacestus and Abraeus, 2 officers who had previously distinguished themselves in battle. Alexander quickly realized they would be easy targets for archers inside if they stayed atop the battlements, and were in mortal danger. Determined to die fighting, Alexander jumped from the battlements into the citadel, closely followed by the others. Fierce fighting broke out.
Holy crap. Again, Alexander's bravery is amazing. He's literally outnumbered in enemy territory. First thing he does is leap into battle. What a Giga Chad.
When the Mallians realized that they had Alexander himself trapped and attempted to swarm the 4. It was a desperate affair, Alexander fighting with his back to a tree, the 4 men attempting to fend off any attackers that came close. Abraeus was cut down in the fighting, leaving only Leonatus and Bacestus carrying the shield of Achilles to protect Alexander. In the chaotic fighting, a Mallian archer managed to shoot Alexander, the arrow piercing his ribs and probably puncturing a lung. Alexander was forced to his knees, coughing up blood. Bacestus placed the shield of Achilles over Alexander to protect his body, and together with Leonatus, prepared to defend him to the last. The rest of Alexander's army had, fortunately, not been idle. As soon as they had seen their king jump from the battlements, they had been seized by a kind of desperate frenzy, launching themselves at the citadel's gates.
Dude, Alexander has gotten so injured so many times in this series, it's insane. Like I said, the fact that he didn't die in battle, I think is probably the most, like, unbelievable thing ever, right? Because, like, with how many injuries he sustained, it's like, I'm surprised that didn't get him, you know? But yeah.
Smashing their way through, they fought their way through the defenders to search for Alexander. Upon seeing his body in a pool of blood, they lost all control, massacring any Mallians left in the city in revenge. With the city taken, Alexander was taken from the battlefield for surgery to remove the arrow. Due to the arrow being barbed, it required a deep incision to be made to pull it out, and the combined blood loss of the initial wound and the operation almost killed Alexander. He did, however, survive, but spent days almost completely bedridden, and it is still debated whether he ever completely recovered from the wound. It had been a remarkable display of Alexander's bravery or foolhardiness, depending on opinion. While the sources do disagree on the names of some of the individuals involved, Bacestus' involvement is certain and common across all the sources. In recognition for his bravery, Alexander expanded the ranks of his personal bodyguard to 8 in order to incorporate him, and he would later ensure that Bacestus was assigned one of the richest provinces of the empire. Among the rank-and-file soldiers, rumor had spread that Alexander had died. Some were worried about who would command the army in his absence, others doubting whether they would be able to make it home without him. On numerous occasions, the generals tried to reassure the men, and Alexander even wrote a letter to be dispersed among his men, but they refused to believe any of it. Alexander instead ordered that he be taken by ship past the camp at such a distance that they would recognize him, but not close enough that they could see how weak he currently was. A wave from his hand was enough to calm the men. His generals, however, are said to have been relieved about his recovery, but also rather critical of Alexander, reprimanding him for being so reckless, lamenting the fact that he almost died taking, in the grand scheme of things, a rather nondescript city thousands of miles from home while still so young, and urging him to stay out of the fighting more in the future. Alexander thanked them for their concern, but claimed that he measured his life not in years, but in victories, saying, "I am bound to desire an abundant life rather than a long one. I will meet, unterrified, the hazards of war and Ares."
Yeah, definitely a short but glorious life. Very Achilles-esque, eh? But, I do find it kind of poetic that it was the shield of Achilles that helped preserve Alexander's life there, considering how big of a fan he was, you know, of the legendary mythological warrior. But yeah, it's like, I had heard that, yeah, the king monarchs were to fight, but like Alexander took it to another level. It's like, you know what I mean? His generals are completely right. After a while, it's like, Alexander, you don't have to prove how brave you are, maybe staying out of the fighting would be better. But again, Alexander, man, the fact that he didn't die in battle is just an interesting thing.
In approximately spring of 325, after spending weeks recovering, Alexander was eventually well enough to travel again. In the time that he'd spent recovering, word of the Mallian defeat had reached the Oxydracians, who quickly submitted without fighting as a result. Alexander's blitzkrieg strategy had proved to be a complete success. With the two peoples subdued, Alexander and his army once again journeyed down the Acacinis and Indus, aiming for the ocean. Many of the cities en route submitted passively, Alexander only facing light resistance for the most part. However, in many of these cities that did submit, the Brahmins, who were advisors as well as religious figures, often stirred dissent and rebellions behind Alexander, forcing him to send men back to crush the revolts and execute the Brahmins. It would not be the last time that these holy men would prove a problem for him. Upon reaching Patala, Alexander sent many of the older veterans as well as roughly 4,500 other men with Craterus to Camanea through Arachosia, the first stage of those veterans' long journey home to Macedonia. After resting the remainder of his men at Patala for a time, Alexander planned the final stage of his voyage. The Indus at this point split into two arms, Alexander choosing to sail down the west. Strong winds, however, damaged many ships, forcing him to return. He was undaunted, however, and when better weather arrived, Alexander once again tried the passage, and having spent roughly 7 months sailing down the Hydaspes, finally achieved his long-held dream of reaching the ocean. Barely 10 years ago, he had been fighting small tribes around Illyria and contesting with rival claimants to the throne of Macedonia. Now he stood on the coast of the Indian Ocean, with all the lands between him and his homeland conquered. He was only 31 years old. Alexander sailed.
Amazing, dude. Again, how much he accomplished in such a short life. It really is astounding. Man.
Briefly in the waters of the ocean, making sacrifices and leaving altars on a small island that would mark the furthest southern point of his empire. He then began to lay plans for a massive exploratory effort, charging Nearchus with leading the fleet into the Persian Gulf and mapping the coast before sailing up the Euphrates to Babylon. Alexander, meanwhile, took his force to the Arabius River and the land of the Aritians, splitting his army once more into 3 parts to quickly capture the region, and leaving Leonatus and a portion of his army to control the area. In the autumn of 325, Alexander led the rest of his army and a baggage train into the territory of the Gedrossians, aiming to hug the coast and dig wells and leave supplies for Nearchus's fleet. It would prove to be the biggest mistake of Alexander's career.
Yeah, I think his crossing of the desert, where he lost a good amount of his army, there have been speculation where he did it on purpose to punish them for not going into India proper, but also, I've also heard he just made a mistake, so I don't know.
Scouting parties soon reported to Alexander that there was no drinking water along the coast, forcing Alexander to take a shorter, more direct road inland through the Gedrossian desert.
It was previously thought that Alexander's march through the Gedrossian desert hugged the coastline. However, recent scholarship based largely on a detailed study by Angelus favors a more direct inland approach,
aiming for the city of Pura. The result was a march of roughly 450 miles. The scorching temperatures in the day forced the army to march largely throughout the night, slowing progress down massively. When their supplies ran out, the army tried to eat the roots of palm trees and killed what pack animals they had for food. As a result of this, however, they were unable to carry their sick or wounded, and men that fell behind were left to die of thirst, starvation, or exposure. On the rare occasions that the army could find water, many men, unable to restrain themselves, drank too much too fast, dying from water intoxication. On one particular occasion, when the army was encamped near a small brook, a flash flood struck, carrying away men, baggage, and camp followers. These factors forced Alexander to move his army to always encamp a certain distance away from water when it was found, putting even more strain on the already deteriorating force. For 60 days, the army suffered through the desert, before finally reaching the safety of Pura, where they could rest and recuperate. There are a few points regarding Alexander's march through the Gedrossian desert which are worth discussing. Firstly, Nearchus would later write that Alexander had chosen to march through the desert to try and outdo the Assyrian queen, Semiramis, and Persian Cyrus the Great, both of who had supposedly crossed the desert, emerging with only a fraction of their force intact. Arrian is quick to note, however, that it is Nearchus alone who makes this claim. It would not have been the first time that Alexander had seemingly been motivated by a desire to outdo previous great rulers, and this could well have been a factor in his consideration. But the route Alexander planned did also have, at least initially, a strategic purpose in resupplying the fleet. It seemed likely, based on Alexander's need to send scouting parties to look for water by the coast, that he was ignorant of the territory, and that his march was thus a genuine strategic blunder, rather than being a result of purely selfish motivations. Second is the idea that Alexander was attempting to punish his men for mutinying at the Hephaestus by taking them through a particularly torturous route. This is a particularly cynical interpretation that has a number of glaring problems. The mutiny had happened months earlier, and though Alexander could certainly hold a grudge, one wonders why he waited so long to punish the men. We also have other examples of Alexander punishing mutineers, and he did so by executing ringleaders rather than punishing the entire army. Moreover, Alexander himself, as well as close friends and companions, suffered all the same hardships as the army. He personally led scouting missions, and in one particularly famous anecdote, when Alexander's men had gone to great difficulty to bring him water, he thanked them but then poured it away, refusing to drink unless all his men could. Whether this particular anecdote is true or not can be debated, but what cannot be debated is that Alexander was putting himself in as much danger as his men. Lastly, the sources are clear that Alexander did not have his full army with him. Part of the force had been left in Ora with Leonatus, while yet another significant portion, notably with many veterans, had been sent on an alternative route under Craterus' command. It was the veterans who had been the core of the mutiny at the Hephaestus, and so these movements make no sense if one assumes Alexander was attempting to punish the men. The final point to address is the number of men that Alexander lost. Plutarch, the only source to provide any kind of figure, claims that Alexander lost as much as 3/4 of his entire army. Plutarch, by his own admission, however, was not a historian, and his figures are often some of the most exaggerated in the available sources. Moreover, as we have seen, Alexander did not take his full force into Gedrossia. He took a portion, possibly as many as 30 to 40,000, according to modern estimates. Much of the rest of Alexander's army was sent via the other route under Craterus, or left as garrison forces in conquered regions, such as that under Leonatus. It is also hard to discern how many deaths were sustained by Alexander's military forces, and how many were camp followers. Modern historians continue to debate what the most likely figure is, and as of yet there is no consensus on the matter. What does seem apparent is that Alexander lost more men marching through the desert than in any of his battles, and so at the very least, his losses were likely in the thousands. Whatever the true number, Alexander's decision to march through the desert is widely regarded as his greatest mistake. Alexander's arrival at Pura effectively marked the end of his Indian campaign. It had been a series of low and high points in his career. On the one hand, the campaign had stretched his men's morale almost to breaking point at the Hephaestus, had used some particularly brutal tactics, had resulted in the deaths of potentially thousands of men marching through the Gedrossian desert, and had resulted in a wound that had almost killed Alexander, and may well have been a contributing factor to his early death. Furthermore, the Brahmins, a constant thorn in Alexander's side while in India, continued to lead revolts throughout territories taken by Alexander, ultimately resulting in many of them being abandoned by Hellenic forces over the next few years and being absorbed into the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta. On the other hand, Alexander achieved arguably his most impressive military victory at the Hydaspes, had shown his incredible strategic talent during the Mallian campaign, taking the empire to its greatest extent, completed his lifelong dream of reaching the ocean, and opened up the Indian subcontinent to the Hellenic world, an achievement that would have deep and far-reaching implications. Alexander would spend the next year consolidating his empire, attempting to create even deeper ties between his Hellenic and Persian subjects, and planning future campaigns. But his Indian campaign would prove to be his last. In just under 2 years, he would be dead. We will cover these plans, his return to Babylon, and his ultimate final days in the coming episodes, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
Dang, so that's it, guys. That's the end of Alexander's military exploits. Man, I can't believe we've already made it this far. Honestly, like, yeah, you just see the hype of Alexander. I feel like I really love looking at this series because it gave me a deeper perspective into what made Alexander great, you know what I mean? And yeah, this campaign in particular was kind of a sore point in terms of Alexander's brutality being revved up, the falling out of his army and him, the strategic mistake of the desert march, him almost dying over, you know, something so insignificant, like, you know what I mean? Like a city not that great in the grand scheme of things, you know? I don't know, I just feel like there's a lot going on here. You see definitely the cracks, but at the same time, yeah, he also had one of his greatest battles, and it definitely added to his glory. But yeah, you do see some cracks starting to form for Alexander, I feel. I don't know, I just think overall, yeah, there's a reason why Alexander is just so revered, and I feel like this series has really shown in great detail about what made Alexander who he was. And I feel like, just once again, I applaud Kings and Generals, who is, you know, my favorite historical YouTuber. I just love this series. This is the series I've been most looking forward to watching. We're not done yet, by the way. I know it sounds like I'm wrapping it all up. No, we have plenty more Alexander videos, and then the Diadochi Wars thereafter, so we're gonna... There's still a lot more to go, but I'm just saying, since this is the end of the main fighting of Alexander, you know, it's... You know, it feels like an end to some degree, right? So, yeah, I'm gonna stop the video here. Tomorrow we're gonna be watching Alexander's last year and his reforms and plans. With that said, I'll see you guys later. Bye, everyone.